This is the Carrier extension, which can make CT entries carried by other CT entries, which means the carried entry will not be able to move and will only move with the carrier unless it's a driver. First, I'm going to throw out a few items in my test area. We'll drop Ravina into the adult dragon as a carried item, the dragon being the carrier, so it can move it around. It's got widgets that indicate which is the carrier, also names displayed on the tooltips. If you hold the shift down, you can move the carried item around to reposition. Otherwise, it's defaulted to one of 8 corners of the square, or 8 sides. It can never move unless it's a driver or it's disconnected from the carrier status. It can also be turned invisible, which is irrespective of the CT entry visibility. It's only turning on and off the map visibility, which is handy for when you don't want your players to see who else is being carried or just to see the carrier. Right now, I've gone ahead and made Ravina a driver, so she can now move everything just like the carrier can. And I've also tried to remove it to dismount, and it failed and told me why, because it's not enabled. You have to unlock it at the carrier level to be able to use the delete on the dismount so that a player could do it themselves. And then they're disconnected back to normal. Ravina's going back on as a carried item. And I'm going to just show the main carrier disconnecting. Pretty much the same thing, just goes back to normal. We're going to put Ravina back on again. And just to show that it's hooked up. And I'm going to move her a little bit outside because it's easier to see the movement when it's not at the default positioning. So I'm going to exaggerate those movements. I'm going to drop Big Boy on Ravina as also. Ravina is a carrier of Big Boy, so it's independent but also tied to its carrier. And the orientations are all changed across the board when you rotate something that's carried, including all of its carried items. Of course, nothing can move while it's carried unless it's a driver. I'm going to go ahead and put Anaris also on there. So there's now a carrier of 3 up there that's tied to the carrier of 1. Or, sorry, 2 carried items tied to Ravina, and she's tied to the dragon. And I'm just going around and showing you that you can spin things that are not tied to as carriers, and they'll just spin on their own as normal. But if it is a carrier and you've got the orientation option set, it's going to rotate everything, including all the things below it. I'm going to go ahead and set everything. This is my standard test. Kind of spread them out so you can see it by exaggerated movement. Now notice they go through walls in LOS. There's no way in FGU to prevent, anything but the central moving token from respecting the LOS boundaries. And of course, when you put stuff on top of other things, you can't really select them easily in FGU. It's also a limitation, which is why I tend to throw them all out here and exaggerate it. If I threw them under the dragon, you just wouldn't be able to pick them easily because FGU does not allow that kind of thing. Now I'm dropping actions from the carrier onto the carried items. In this case, I've dropped the bite of the dragon onto Ravina by dragging it onto the icon. There's 3 ways to do it. I can drag it onto the carried icon for the carrier, or the carrier's icons for the carried, or the actual map token. As you can see, it's actually taking into account that it's not Ravina doing the attack, even though it's her target being applied. Obviously, with this test scenario, it's not very likely that unless you wanted to pretend you were training to have the dragon trigger the bite. dragon was hidden on the CT of the player's side, and all they had was Ravina, but they could see the map token and drag it around and control it. But it's really just a demo in this case, showing what can be done. I'll show some other things later. I'm going to drop different ones, and it doesn't protect against duplicates on the actions either. You can have as many of them as you want, and then you can delete them if the lock is unlocked, and or delete the entire item. So right now I can also double click on the carried icon. That when it's the carried icon, it means I'm a carrier because I've got carried items there. And if I double click on that, it'll remove them all. So what I do here is I double click on that. They're all gone. I'm still carried, but all my carried items are gone. And you can see they're disconnected now, back to normal. And I'll go down and remove Edgard's. He's still carried, but he's disconnected now from Tanar. And so on and so on. Now here's just an example I used for, because you're going to have to use your imagination of what the purposes for this are. There's more than I'm going to tell in this video because it's just too long. It's a tool like a hammer and a nail. If you hammer your thumb or you drive a nail through your thumb, it's not my lookout. It's yours. You're using a tool. Do it wisely or don't do it. What I'm doing here is I'm mounting a skeleton onto the rider. And he's going to go after Merry and Pippin with their tree end over there. And I'm just showing a basic example of what you could do. And then, of course, when Pippin and Merry see the skeletal rider coming toward them, they're going to climb up on the tree end themselves. And I've got the token height thing here also, so I'll set them to 15 feet high on the side of the tree end. And so now they're targeting whichever, the horse or the rider, as they want, but they're also 15 feet up, and you can play that out how you want, and then they're moving around and just doing their thing. Again, I'll probably be setting most of the carrieds in my games to invisible so that only the player can see them next to the carried thing if it's relevant, or to hide it so that they don't see what's actually on something. Like the rider, they'd see, but if it were inside a ship or something, maybe they wouldn't see them, and I'd set them all to invisible. So when they saw the item, they wouldn't see all the carried things that it's actually got. What else? Just kind of going through this. This is another example. Again, I'm not going to show you all the examples you can do. I just took a minute, and it took me about 60 seconds to just make an NPC enemy ship with a cannon that had 2 cannons. And it was trivial to do, so I'm going to go ahead and put this enemy ship out there and tie it to these 2 bandits who are on the ship, and they're going to be manning the cannons of the enemy ship. I'm going to reposition them a little so that it's more to my liking, just for view purposes, no other reason. Although you could have reasons. And of course, again, if I stick them under that main icon, I'm going to have trouble picking them. So that's why you see me dragging them to the edges. And why the default will always place them along the edges, so that you have a chance to actually grab them. Again, FGU limitation. So I've set it up this way, and they look nice. And I'm going to go ahead and put my friendly ship out there too. And I'm going to assign the actions for each of these to have a cannon for all the players and non-players alike. Again, in my world with combat groups and assistant GM, I'm going to be having players run the NPCs usually and just watch what happens. Like I'd have a player running both ships, or 4 players. And I could also basically set the ship so that it wasn't visible on the CT, so that end turn and turns wouldn't actually give it a turn, but it would still be visible on the map. And so that when I do the turns, it would just be the players, and they'd be manning the cannons. So, and here I drag it closer this is a pretty big map and pretty wide area. And I'm, even this close, I'm still out of range for my guns, or I'm in range, but it's going to be a disadvantage roll probably. I have stuff that figures that out. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the attacks, and drag my cannon over to the 2 bandits. And I can do that by dropping it over the carrier icon under the carried item, or the carried icon token field under the carrier, or the token itself on the map. Like this is what I envision doing most times. I'll just do it like that. And so now everybody has a cannon. And I go ahead and try out to make sure it's targeting right, and keep in mind it's targeting it as a ship. In this case, you can see the disadvantage was applied because it's out of range, or it's in that disadvantage range. And it also did a critical miss, and I have that set. And I go ahead and do that. It says it did a hit anyway, but I'm going to move it close so that I don't have all this disadvantage roll going on. Here I go ahead and run Pippin 2. He does a hit. And I look at the bandit. I'm going to start the turn and just say, here goes the bandit captain. He's taking his turn. It goes to Mary 2. They take a shot with a cannon at the ship. It's a hit. He rolls the damage. Boom, damage is applied. All as if fired from the actual carrier of the ship. Go to the next turn. Again, hit. Again, damage from Pippin. Now I'm going to skip the ships. I probably wouldn't even have them visible to the players or me on my CT through combat groups, and just have it so that only the players are firing, or the carried guys, and they just battle it out. And that's another way this can be played out. And that's probably enough of that. I'll wait till it goes to the options, which I'm going to show in just a second. Because as you can see, it has names, tells you who the carrier is, tells you who carried by, and it has icons next to it. So I'm still attacking. Wow, I thought I would have gone to the next part. Naturally, I'm exhausted from writing this. It's like the most work I've done in an extension, I think, even more than polymorphism. So here I go to options, and there are 3 options in this. One is the orientation, which can be optional. I never envision not running with orientation, but if it's off, then it's only orthogonal movement, right? It's just never going to change. You'll do your normal rolling around of the ship, and it just won't affect it. And if you do when it's off and roll the ship, instead of rolling all your guys with it, it's just going to roll the ship. There's an example. And what next? The icons. As you can see, there's all those, carrier. It's got the carrier widget on it. And all these guys have who they're carried by. And when I turn it off, they all go away, as you can see. And that's true on the player side too. And there's no longer any hint that they're carried or indicator that they're carried, even though they still are. And you turn it back on, and it's real time, right? So again, that's one of the other options. And then the main option, whether the extension is either on or off. If it's off, it just wipes the entire database of any carrier-related data, period. I use it to clean up, essentially. I just flick it on and off, and I've cleaned up everything, whether I see it or not, if you're using combat groups. The entire thing. And I'm just showing you here that they're disconnected. Now, why did I write this stupid extension that took me so much time? For this one single purpose. I have a game where I run Star Wars 5e, and I have a current ship coming up that's going to be under combat, where it's got players manning the ship, and during the ship, there's going to be firing outside the ship, and there's going to be firing inside a different map of the ship while somebody's trying to stop them from inside also. So certain players are going to be, when it gets to be their turn, they'll be running from this map, and then certain other players, when it gets to be their turn, they'll be running from the internal ship schematics, fighting someone internal to the ship itself. And that's why I did all this, so that they could sit there and fire the laser cannons and the concussion, and different people could have that who were manning the ship, and then the people who weren't manning the ship could run around on the inside. And it was all easy for me, because there's a turn, double click on the group, the other map comes up, and turn, double click on the group if it's a different map, and just life is easier. I'll go to extremes to work to get my games to be simple. And that's pretty much it. This is why I did it. Whatever happens in terms of selling it to other people, I'm not going to give it for free for sure. Will be up to Grim, and I'll let him decide what he wants to do. But I've got what I wanted, and that's basically this little part here, which is why I wrote it. Okay, end. This has been pretty long. Please end. Stop. Finite.